Started, Steve. Perfect. Thanks. So greetings to everyone. Welcome to today's very exciting WFRN VCS event, which features the 6 finalists for the 2023 Rosabeth Moss Kanter Award for Excellence in Work-Family Research. My name is Richard Petz. I'm a WFRN board member, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this VCS event on behalf of WFRN's leadership team. Our president, Ellen Galinsky, executive director, Stephen Sweet, and vice president, Jen Hook, who is recovering from COVID. I also want to recognize the sponsorship of the Population Research Institute at Penn State University for these VCS events. Before introducing our speakers and getting out with the program for today, just a number of announcements. First, I want to acknowledge that by joining us today, you are consenting to being recorded. And the recording will be posted on WFRN's website for those members who were unable to attend today. The second announcement is that I want to acknowledge that these events are made possible by the generous support of WFRN members. If anyone is here today who is not a member yet, I would encourage you to become one, to check out our website, WFRN.org. And check out the benefits of becoming a member, and we will, as is just there's the link for you to become a member if you're not one already. Third announcement is, as you're at the website and checking things out, we would encourage you to check out the donation section of the website where you can contribute to sustaining the Kanter Award and helping to ensure that the award sticks around for many, many, many years to come into the future. And finally, I would encourage all of you to save the date for the next WFRN in-person conference, which will be June 20th to 22nd, 2024 in Montreal. The theme is Big Questions in Work and Family. And submissions are now open, and they will be open through November 1st. The board and the committee are working diligently to make this a really exciting event. And so I would encourage you all to plan to attend. Finally, our next VCS event, our virtual conference series event, will be coming on October 20th. And it will feature Sarah Flood and Leanna Sayer on using American Time Use survey data to investigate work, family, and well-being before and during the pandemic, excuse me. And so registrations for that will open up soon. Having said all that, again, the plan today is to hear from all 6 Kanter Award finalists. Each will be given about 8 to 9 minutes to present their work. Before we get to those outstanding papers, I'd first like to introduce Shelley MacDermid Wadsworth, who is Distinguished Professor in Human Development and Family Science and Director Emerita of the Center for Families at Purdue University, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to express my sincere and enthusiastic thanks to Jennifer Hook and WFRN for deciding that they would like to feature Kanter nominated or winning researchers to be featured during this virtual series. It's just such a wonderful development in the life of the Kanter Award. I also want to recognize the many, many reviewers who have served on the award committee over the years. I see several on this call who have served for multiple years. This award could not happen without them, and particularly as the world gets busier and busier, I become ever more grateful for their willingness to contribute to our profession in this way. And of course, I want to acknowledge the wonderful work of the nominees and the winners of this award, both this year and over the last almost 25 years now. It's such a great pleasure to be able to share good news with people and to try to elevate our field in this way. As I said, the award was created almost 25 years ago now, in 1999. So I think we're going to be celebrating the 25th at the WFRN conference in 2024. It was originally created because at the time I felt that our community was very fragmented. We didn't have WFRN then, and we had researchers in all kinds of disciplines doing very relevant work, but often without much awareness of the work that was going on in other areas. And people repeatedly complained to me that they felt that we were asking the same questions over and over again, or finding the same answers over and over again. They wanted to push forward. And I thought an award might be a way to promote conversation across those stovepipes, to help the community come together, to generate conversation about what do the new frontiers of our research across all of our disciplines need to be. And I think those conversations, thanks to WFRN, are happening now in ways that they were not then. And so the Kanter Award becomes a celebration of great work. It becomes also an archive for teaching and research. I think that if you look at the lists over the years, it becomes a great way to point students to what's happened in the work family literature in recent years. And one of the best things we get to do is to write letters to deans and department heads about the great researchers that they have on their faculties, which is an especial pleasure to do when they're assistant professors, because hopefully that helps them keep their jobs and keep doing the work that they're doing, and helps our profession to grow. So I just am so grateful to have had the opportunity to be involved with this effort, and for all of the people who have helped, and for the great partnership with WFRN, and of course, the Boston College Center for Work and Family, which has been a peer partner in this effort from literally 10 minutes after I had the idea to create the award. We couldn't do it without them either, and they make it possible for corporate practitioners to participate in the review process, to fund the work of the award, and to disseminate the results of this research out into the community of practitioners. So thank you all, and I look for, oh, one last thing. I'm sorry, but I had a pre-existing commitment to give a talk at noon, and I'm going to step away for that, but please do not assume that that means that I am not passionately interested in everything everyone is going to say this morning. All right, now I'm done.
Thank you, Shelley. Now turning to the finalists, we will start off with the winners of the Kanter Award this year, Annette Fasang and Silke Eisenbrei.
So thank you very much. Silke is here too. All I can say is we feel incredibly honored among this list of distinguished finalists. Thank you so much, Shelley, for all your work with the award and everybody involved in the reward. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to move to the paper first, so we can also move to the others. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. So our paper is entitled Uncovering Social Stratification, Intersectional Inequalities in Work and Family Life Courses by Gender and Race. What was our motivation behind this? A lot of our work centers on a life course perspective, where we assume that enduring and accumulated economic disadvantages only become visible over longer periods of the life course. So in addition to sort of snapshot views at single periods of time, we need to look at the longer enduring and accumulated disadvantages. Now, in quantitative studies on work-family life courses, race is often only a control variable, and many studies only focus on women. And this seemed to us a very important blind spot, especially with the rising awareness and this big literature on intersectionality. But this work very often centers more on identity categories and less so on structural inequalities, and often uses non-representative samples. So what we wanted to do in this paper is develop a research design and some theoretical arguments, bringing together a population level quantitative life course perspective with an intersectionality approach to look at structural inequalities in work and family life courses by gender and race. And also we're kind of trying to develop these life course typologies ranked by earnings or prestige, for example, as one representation of social stratification that takes into account longer periods of the life course. So in this paper, we build on the concept of interdependence between work and family life courses, going back to life course theory. Interdependence between life domains is defined as when individuals' goals, resources, and behaviors in one domain, work or family, are interrelated with goals, resources, and behaviors in others, which obviously is the case for work and family lives, but in different ways for men and women, and also different racial and ethnic groups. So work and family lives continually affect one another through various causal and selection effects, and we have great papers studying these different effects also in a more causal fashion. But all of these causal and selection effects that unfold over longer periods of time sum up to create stronger or weaker correlations between, let's say, 2 decades of work and family lives. And this is sort of the kind of bigger picture we wanted to take in this paper, focusing on the degree of interrelation. So here we quantify how strongly our work and family life courses interrelated for Black men and women and white men and women, and what's the type of interrelation. So which work and family life courses typically co-occur for these different groups. Now, on the degree of work-family interdependence, we hypothesized that Blacks will have stronger work-family interdependence than whites on average because they hold on average lower socioeconomic positions, and these constrain their family lives, low education, unemployment, and so on. And concerning gender, women will have on average stronger work-family interdependence than men, because here it goes the other way around. For them, events in their family lives, like parenthood, have stronger repercussions on their subsequent work careers. So here the hypothesis bringing these two together, and of course we develop it much more fully in the paper, would be that we find the strongest interrelation between work and family lives so that they mutually condition and constrain one another for Black women, the weakest for white men, and Black men and white women would sort of be in between. But we don't only want to quantify the degree of interrelation. I do think it's important as an indicator also of constraints, but we want to also look at the content, the typical interrelations that occur. So which work and family lives typically are experienced by these different intersectional groups. And here we develop 3 types. One is that stable, high prestige careers and family lives of parenthood and stable partnerships mutually support and sustain each other over the long term. So we expect this to occur for men, and especially for Black men, who will depend even more on sort of resource co-production in work and family lives. On the contrary, for women, we expect that these stable, high prestige careers and family lives of parenthood and stable partnerships will be competing alternatives due to gendered caretaking norms. They have to allocate finite resources to either work or family. And these two, stable, high prestige careers and these family lives of parenthood and stable partnerships won't co-occur for women to the same extent as for men. Also, building on life course theory, we were particularly interested in instability spillovers. So to what extent interrupted low prestige careers co-occur with family complexity, separation, frequent separation, and repartnering. So here we expect these instability spillovers to be more prevalent among Blacks and white women because they are more strongly concentrated in these interrupted low prestige careers, which will then also spill over into their family lives. So we used the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, cohorts born 1957 to 64, which we observed them for 20 years up until age 44, until midlife. This is really important because a lot of the variability we are interested in, career progression, having a second or third child, divorces happen in midlife, but that means we are somewhat restricted to older cohorts, and sequence analysis. Some new measures that have been developed here to quantify correlations between different domains, so work and family. In the family domain, we distinguish between people being single with or without kids and partnered with children up to 3+ children. The work-life courses we operationalized based on occupational prestige categories, where in the graphs I will show you light yellow is low prestige and dark red is high prestige, so most advantageous careers. But we also have the reasons for being out of the labor force, like parental leave in education, or being simply out of the labor force, not working. Here you see an example of our data. So these are just 10 life courses, random life courses, family life courses picked out of the NLSY. You see the lowest one, for example, light blue is partnered, no child, then at age 25 has a child. But we also see there's quite a bit of variability, very different experiences. Up here, number 9 has a stretch of single parenthood, then repartners. So these are things going on in people's life courses. Now, first, the degree of interdependence. These are the monthly coefficients we calculated, and indeed we see for white women, there's no significant correlation between work and family life courses. It's close to 0 and not statistically significant. For Black women, indeed, it's the strongest, with white women and Black men in between, as we expected. Now I'm going to show you a very colorful graph, but I'll only show you the one for Black women. You see on the left-hand side, family life courses. The green here, for example, are stretches of single parenthood, and the right-hand side, work life courses. This is the life course typology approach that we use to look at the content. What are the typical work and family life courses that jointly occur for these different intersectional groups? And here, for example, for Black women, they are ranked by the highest prestige life course types in the top to the lowest prestige life course type at the bottom. The group at the bottom, I think we've seen a lot of research about Black women who are single parents and in unstable, low prestige careers. There's a lot of parental leave, which basically means they report being out of the labor force for family reasons, not that they receive any benefits necessarily, or also the Black being out of the labor force. But I think groups that are much less visible in public and academic debate are these sizable groups of Black single mothers who hold stable middle-class jobs, also 22%, or these 18% who are single and childless, also in stable middle-class jobs. And what we see here is that for Black women, as we expected, these most successful careers of medium prestige careers don't go along with stable partnerships, so marriage and parenthood, but they're single mothers and single childless women. So these mutually competing relationships. To see the graphs for Black men and white women, you'll have to look at the paper due to time constraints here, but let me sum up the main findings. We find a mutually supporting relationship between parenthood and stable partnerships and high prestige careers for a small group of Black men, only 19%. Actually, 80% of Black men in our cohort are in unstable, low prestige careers. For Black women, parenthood and stable partnerships and high prestige careers are competing alternatives, and very high prestige careers do not even occur in sizable numbers at all. They do for Black men, but not for Black women. What we find for white women is that more often they enter these high prestige careers later in the life course. And if they enter high prestige careers and have children after they are in the high prestige careers, then they can also enjoy the sort of sustain these careers and having children in a stable partnership, because then they enjoy resources like high income and so on, of course, that allow them to outsource care activities. So on the spillover, instability spillovers, we do find these groups among Black women, Black men, and white women. But I think here the relevant finding is this applies to 34% of our cohorts for Black women, but only 13% for white women and 22% for Black men. So similar life course experiences, but they characterize very different shares of these intersectional groups. What do we conclude? First of all, we think a longitudinal population level view on intersectional inequalities is necessary to display the full variety of work-family experiences. If you look at the literature, previous research often focuses only on the socially problematic cases or the poor, urban poor Black families, for example. And these perspectives really neglect the sizable groups of, for example, stable middle-class Black single mothers. And an intersectional perspective, therefore, also needs this social demography population level perspective. Now, turning to policy conclusions, to reduce intersectional inequalities in work and family lives, interventions should target racial and gender inequalities in economic starting conditions and economic opportunities across the life course. So we strongly advocate, and we fully develop this in the paper, that economic interventions are the way to go. Policies should not attempt to intervene in family lives, which would likely be ineffective and is normatively contentious anyways. But if you think, for example, of these marriage promotion programs, the most occupationally successful Black women are unmarried women. So it's not very sensible to promote marriage promotion for those who are in the low prestige interrupted careers. Thank you so much for attention. I hope I'm halfway in time.
Thank you, Annette. Our second presenters will be Margot Jackson and Daniel Snyder, presenting their paper, Public Investments and Class Gaps in Parents' Developmental Expenditures.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and get this up here. Oops. Sorry about that. Trying to make this, okay, can you guys all see this? Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This is a great event, and congratulations to all of the nominees and, of course, the winning paper, which was really exciting to hear. This is a paper that was collaborative with Danny Schneider, who's at Harvard. And although we started the paper before the pandemic unfortunately highlighted, of course, the important role that the social safety net plays in allowing families to balance work and family life, to provide basic needs for both parents and children, and to reduce poverty and economic instability. And as we can see from these headlines, our country's kind of brief foray into a European-style welfare state largely did not last. However, during this period, certainly the public conversation among both policymakers as well as the public certainly was elevated in terms of the role that a strong social safety net can play in allowing families to make healthy choices for themselves and for both parents and for children. So although this conversation may have been elevated among the public, certainly as family researchers, we're all aware that both families and governments are the primary sources of investment in children. We also know from a really strong body of cross-national research that the strength of the welfare state may have an equalizing effect on various dimensions of parental behavior, which is often hypothesized to be a really key pathway, right, through which intergenerational inequalities get reproduced. But we actually know fairly little about how parental behavior in its many forms is affected by the kind of policy context of investment. And so that's where we came in this paper to ask the specific question of whether class gaps by levels of income and education in parental behavior are narrower in context of higher public investment for children and families. And just briefly, there are two large bodies of research that kind of motivate this focus. The first is the very large body of research over the last several decades demonstrating the ways in which various forms of parenting behavior differ really strikingly across social class groups. So we know that children in the United States have experienced what was not only what Sarah McClanahan called diverging destinies of family structure, maternal employment, but that there's also been a similar divergence in the content of parental behavior with children, which of course is strongly related to compositional features like maternal employment and family structure. At the same time, from a kind of separate and smaller body of research, we know that parents across the socioeconomic distribution really now more than ever hold much more similar values, ideologies, objectives with respect to parenting. And this is the case more so today than has been the case in any other decade. And so these patterns, which, on the surface are seemingly at odds with each other, we think prompted consideration of the factors that can offset what are really consequential family level inequalities. And so how does the welfare state shape parenting was our focus. In particular, we complement what is largely a cross-national body of evidence with a detailed assessment of how change over time in safety net spending across US states shapes inequalities in parental expenditures, which may be very strongly implicated in various dimensions of children's well-being. To do this, we use data from two different sources. The first was a database that I collected in collaboration with colleagues at the Urban Institute called the State-by-State Spending on Kids dataset. This is a state-by-year database of public spending in states from both federal as well as state and local sources, spanning the period between, for the paper, 1997 to 2014. We've just expanded the data to go through 2022. So this allows us to measure per child spending at the state year level across a variety of, on a number of programs across 4 domains: income support, health, education, and kind of other spending on housing and parks, et cetera. We look at real spending per child in 2016 dollars. This is just a list of the programs to give you a sense of what's included in the state spending database. I'm happy to talk more about this if people have questions. Just to kind of give you a sense of why we focus on states, this graph shows really concisely that states vary quite dramatically in the size of their spending and investments on programs for children and families. So we can see that the highest spending state, which is typically Vermont, spends over 3 times per child on programs relevant to children and families than the lowest spending state, which is typically Utah. States also vary quite a bit within themselves and change over time in how much they invest on family and child-focused programs. We link the state spending data to data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey during the same period, which provides us with really detailed information on household level expenditures on a variety of items. I'd just like to quickly highlight in the red our focal measure of expenditures, which tries to conceptually distinguish from expenditures on kind of basic necessities and focuses instead on what we think of as developmental expenditures for children. So this includes things like books, instruments, arts and crafts, kind of above and beyond, the set of measures that focus on basic necessities. So our first key finding in this paper is that more generous public spending at the state level on programs for children and families is associated with significantly narrower class-based gaps in private parental expenditures. So to illustrate this finding, I'll show you this graph, which shows us that as we look across the x-axis, which shows standard deviations of state year spending on these programs for children and families, we can see that in the highest spending state years, income-based gaps in dollars spent per quarter on developmental items for children are about 50% lower than in the lowest spending state years at the left of the x-axis. We can additionally see that this convergence that we see by income is driven by increases disproportionately in the expenditures of households with the fewest economic resources, right? So the orange line here is the lowest income percentile households, and we can see that those expenditures go up more than the expenditures of groups at the top of the income distribution. Our second main finding is that this equalization that we see by income as well as by education is driven by what we call bottom-up increases in the expenditures of the lowest resource households, particularly in response to progressive or targeted kind of means-tested investments at the state level. So to show you that, we focus here on income support spending on the left and health spending on the right. And we can see that these patterns look very similar to what I showed you in the first graph, where the income convergence that we see across the distribution of state spending is driven by increasing expenditures at the bottom of the income distribution, with really no change at all at the top of the income distribution. In contrast, the convergence, we find that evidence of what we call top-down decrease in the expenditures of the highest resource parents in response to more universalist types of state investments, so namely expenditures on public education. So here we can see that as state education spending increases, the expenditures of the highest income households actually decline, where we see no change at all in the expenditures of the lowest resource households. So overall, our results are consistent with the idea that the family kind of context of investment is sensitive to the state policy context of investment, and that both progressive and universal state investments can have equalizing effects, but those effects are driven by different parts of the economic distribution at the household level. And I'll just end by kind of quickly contextualizing our findings in light of the fact that the welfare state and the safety net for children in the United States has really contracted over time relative to expansions in the safety net for older adults. So we can see this small blue portion of the bar, which is spending on children, has really not changed at all as we see a steady increase in expenditures on older populations. And so this stands in contrast, right, to a growing body of evidence demonstrating that state-level investments in disadvantaged families with children can be a promising means of reducing what are quite stark divides in parental investment and family behavior. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Margot. Our third presentation is from Jane Lanks-Smith. The title of her paper is Negotiating Impossible Ideals, Latent Classes of Intensive Mothering in the United States.
Thank you so much. Can you all see and hear and see the slides as well? Okay,
You're good.
Great. In an effort to keep to time, I'm just gonna jump right into my project. So since the 1960s and 1970s, nearly every developed country has experienced a rise in intensive mothering or high maternal time and energy investments in children. And researchers have documented a rise in several intensive mothering behaviors, including, but not limited to, time spent with kids, time spent in developmental activities, as well as breastfeeding rates and duration. Unsurprisingly, several intensive mothering attitudes have increased in tandem, such as the belief that households should be child-centered, that moms are the essential or kind of irreplaceable parent, that parenting is challenging and should be challenging. And on top of all of that, moms are expected to find their parenting to be incredibly personally fulfilling. For these reasons, research has talked about intensive mothering as the dominant and modal model for mothering in the United States. But at the same time, we know that individuals don't always follow the actions or beliefs that gender norms suggest that they should. By definition, intensive mothering is really demanding of resources, potentially forcing moms to be selective in the areas of their parenting that they are intensive. We also know that some women hear competing cultural ideals which actively advocate for mothers' own health and happiness as an important goal. And finally, research shows that women frequently reframe and negotiate what good mothering is in their own parenting. So this suggests a pretty significant sociological puzzle. On one hand, the expectations of intensive mothering are stronger and more narrow than ever. But on the other hand, we know that moms often still deviate from these norms in their own lives. So rather than a binary of intensive or non-intensive moms, there may be multiple types of intensive moms. Which leads me to my research questions, which were: one, what patterns exist in how mothers adhere to, reject, and combine intensive mothering attitudes and behaviors? And two, how do these patterns vary by sociodemographic characteristics? For this study, the data I used came from the 2014 Child Development Supplement of the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, and my final sample size was 306 mothers with at least one child ages 1 to 5. I incorporated 4 intensive mothering variables in my study, namely the total time moms spent engaged with their kids, time they spent reading to them, playing with them, and breastfeeding duration. So on average, how long they spent breastfeeding their kids. I also incorporated 6 intensive mothering attitudinal variables. So participants were asked to state how much they agree with the following statements. A father should be as heavily involved in the care of his child as the mother. It is essential for the child's well-being that fathers spend time with their children. Fathers play a large role in child development. I often feel tired, worn out, or exhausted from raising a family. I find that taking care of my child is much more work than pleasure. And finally, I feel trapped by my responsibilities as a parent. So to examine patterns in intensive mothering, I used latent class analysis, which identifies hidden subgroups of people which either reject or adhere to facets of intensive mothering in similar ways. So in other words, it identifies groups that are responding to these 10 intensive mothering variables in similar ways. Prior theory predicts that an intensive mother will be really highly intensive on her parenting behaviors. She'll show high levels of essentialism, meaning she'll be more likely to think that moms are the essential or irreplaceable parent compared to fathers. She'll show high levels of tiredness, and she'll show high levels of fulfillment from her parenting. However, none of the 4 latent classes that emerged from my data actually really kind of perfectly fit this pattern. And in fact, the most common group in my data, I titled relaxed mothers, and they were about 33% of the sample, because overall they were fairly non-intensive. They showed low intensity on their intensive mothering behaviors, and they showed low intensity in their attitudes as well. I also examined how each latent class varies by various sociodemographic characteristics, including age, education, income, race, ethnicity, single motherhood status, and employment. And what I found was that relaxed mothers overall had a comparatively low level of what I would call social advantage. The second most prevalent group that emerged from the data was what I titled high investors at about a quarter of the sample. And I think these are the women that we typically think of when we think about an intensive mother. So these women were really high on their parenting behaviors. They spent a lot of time with their kids. They breastfed for long periods. They read to them. They played with them a lot. But as far as their intensive mothering attitudes go, they were just kind of moderate or lower mixed. These women sociodemographically looked pretty different from the relaxed mothers, and that they had overall a very high level of social advantage. The next group in my study I titled essentialist mothers, and they were about 22% of the sample. They were mixed or moderate on how intensive they were in their behaviors. What really set this group apart from the other groups is that they had high levels of essentialism. So they were the least likely of any group to say, yes, fathers should be as involved as moms in the care of their kids. In terms of social advantage, these moms look pretty similar to the relaxed mothers in that they had an overall low level of social advantage. And the last group that emerged from my data, I titled strained mothers. So this was about 20% of the sample. They were mixed or moderate on how intense they were in their behaviors. They had low levels of essentialism. But what really makes this group stand out is their high levels of tiredness and their low levels of fulfillment from parenting. So these are the moms that I'm like a little emotionally concerned about. They were the most likely to say that they felt trapped from their parenting, or that parenting was much more work than pleasure. Overall, these women were very advantaged, and I would probably cite them as the most advantaged group in the sample. Okay, so if there is kind of one big takeaway that I want you to walk away from this presentation with, it's that studies or research often talks about intensive mothering as being the modal model for motherhood in the US. And my data doesn't totally support that. I think that the true modal model for motherhood in the US might not be one of high intensity, but one of actually pretty significant negotiation. There's not just one type of intensive mother in the US, and it's worth noting that no group in my sample was intensive in every area of their parenting. So a lot of recent research has heavily focused on intensive mothers, but I argue that it might be just as crucial to examine and think about the ways that women are not intensive. Okay, thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. Our next presentation is from Layla Schmidt and Katrin Osberg. The paper is titled "A Stall Only on the Surface: Working Hours and the Persistence of the Gender Wage Gap in Western Germany from 1985 to 2014.
Thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be a Kanter finalist, and thank you for playing such a big role in supporting our field. Congratulations to the winners. We really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to present our paper. It's titled "A Stall Only on the Surface: Working Hours and the Persistence of the Gender Wage Gap in Western Germany, 1985 to 2014. This research is a collaboration with Katrin Ausburg, who's also from the University of Munich. The following graph sums up our motivation for this work. The closure of the unadjusted gender wage gap in both the United States, the green line, and in Western Germany, the blue line, has stalled over the last few decades. The 100% would be wage parity of men and women, but the gender wage gap 30 years ago in the 1980s was 74.5% that women earned of men's hourly wage. This has since then stalled, and 30 years later, women still only earn 75.9% of what men earn. So over the last 30 years, the gender wage gap has only decreased by 1.5 percentage points. And these 1.5 percentage points, so almost zero, are the outcome variable in this paper. We ask whether this was a stall only on the surface. Because under the surface, we know from the literature that there's been a grand gender convergence in education and labor market integration of women. And exploring the last chapter, Golding has highlighted the role of temporal flexibility. Previous research has shown the impact of long, more than 50 hours per week work hours on the slowing convergence of the gender wage gap in the United States. So perhaps in the context of Western Germany, particularly short, meaning less than 35 hours per week, work hours might have had an impact on the slowing convergence of the gender wage gap. Logically, there's two ways this is possible. First, due to an increase in the proportion of women working part-time, so-called quantity effects. In Western Germany, there's been major work-family policy changes in the 2000s, granting workers the right to reduce working time to part-time. And the second way this might have been possible is by decreasing returns to part-time work, so-called price effects. Theoretically, these are possible due to fewer career and training options, reduced labor market experience, or potential increase in labor costs. So, looking under the surface, we use the following data and methods. We use longitudinal household data from the German Socioeconomic Panel over 30 years, 1985 to 2014. As methods, we use pooled ordinary least squares, June Murphy-Pierce decompositions we group years in 1985 to 89, and 2010 and 14, including working hours. This method allows us to detect effects that go into opposite directions, widening or narrowing the gender wage gap. And they decompose the gender wage gap in an explained part and an unexplained part, and then continuing the explained gender wage gap into the quantity effects from an increase in labor force participation in part-time of women compared to men, and second, the price effect. So taking a closer look at working hours and labor force participation, we see on the top right that women's part-time work in orange, differentiated in marginal and part-time work, has strongly increased from 1985 to 2014, while men are also working part-time. About every 10th man today works part-time, but there's been much less change for men than for women. And this change in labor supply of hours mirrors the increased labor force participation of women here on the bottom right in the labor market overall. And looking at the second possibility, how working hours can have an impact on the gender wage gap, hourly wages, we see that hourly wages for part-time work as well as overwork, part-time work are the orange lines, overwork is the dark blue line, are lower and decrease over time compared to full-time work, which is the blue line. And this also holds true for adjusted hourly wages, controlling for composition effects. Together, these trends, decomposing the change of the gender wage gap into quantity and price effects, have widened the gender wage gap. This graph shows our main results. So it shows on the left that the unadjusted gender wage gap has only closed, going to the top, 1.5%. Most of the widening below the surface in the explained gender wage gap that we distinguish in the right part of the graphic has been due to work hours, short work hours in marginal and part-time work. And this has widened the gender wage gap by in total 4.4 percentage points, going against effects narrowing the gender wage gap, like women's advances in human capital attainment. In a small add-on, zooming out of the gender wage gap in hours, we also looked at the gender gap in monthly earnings. So the top line is the line for the gender wage gap in Western Germany from our first slide. And below, we see the line for the gender gap in monthly earnings, which has even widened over time because it also accounts for the working hours that men and women supply. And then also looking at the gender wage gap in monthly earnings, unconditional on labor force participation. So assigning women who don't work hourly wages of 1, so we have, because we can't take 0 because of the natural log of hourly wages as the dependent variable, we see a strong decrease in gender inequalities. In conclusion, we show there's a trade-off in gender disparities in labor supply versus wages. So while short hours in Western Germany have widened the gender wage gap, offsetting its closure, Without them, the gender wage gap would have closed an extra 1/6, 4.4 percentage points. Many women incentivized as secondary earners work part-time with lower wages, trapping them in this role of the secondary earner. But part-time work narrows the gender wage gap unconditional on labor force participation, challenging the view that gender wage inequalities in the labor market have only stalled over the last 3 decades. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Layla. Our next presentation is by Nicole Schifrin and Jesse Michelle. The paper is titled Flexible Work Arrangements and Employee Health, a Meta-Analytic Review.
Okay, thank you very much. Hey everyone, my name is Nicole Schifrin, and Dr. Jesse, Michael, and I at Auburn University are very excited to be sharing the results of this work with you all. So flexible working arrangements allow employees to adjust their working location, their working hours, or patterns of work in order to better fit with their personal needs and their lifestyle. And they come in a variety of forms, as seen to the left here, and are implemented for a variety of reasons across organizations. And many of the potential benefits of flexible working arrangements, of those many benefits, we were particularly interested in the health-related implications of participating in flexibility with scheduling. So the overarching question of this research was, are flexible working arrangements associated with employee health, either through engagement in health-related behaviors or through reductions in stress? And theory holds that flexible working arrangements can free up additional resources for workers. This includes time, financial resources, or energy-related resources. And these additional resources can help them better meet the demands of their personal lives and their work lives. These additional resources could result in less stress or better health behaviors such as participation in exercise or more time to cook healthy meals at home, and hopefully ultimately better health as a result. So in exploring research on flexible working arrangements and health, we were finding conflicting results across papers and thought that this body of research would benefit from a meta-analytic exploration of the association between flexible working arrangements and different aspects of health. So 4 different relationships between flexible working arrangements and health were chosen, including a mix of health outcomes and health-related behaviors. And these were physical health, generally absenteeism, somatic symptoms, and physical activity. And we were expecting to see positive relationships between flexible working arrangements and overall physical health, as well as with physical activity, and negative relationships between flexible working arrangements and absenteeism and somatic symptoms. So generally expecting better health behaviors and outcomes as a result of having access to flexible working arrangements. And we were also interested in exploring 2 different moderating effects. The first being whether flex time, or the times that people are working, versus flex place, or the location that people are working, had differing relationships with these different health outcomes. And the second being whether flexible working arrangement availability versus actual usage of available flexible working arrangements moderates the relationship between flexible working arrangements and these outcomes. There can be many reasons employees who may have access to flexible working arrangements don't actually end up using them, even if they would benefit them, such as stigma associated with using flexible working arrangements, concerns about backlash from others at work, and not knowing which arrangements to use or how to best utilize them, and so on. So it's really critical to see if and how workers are using flexible working arrangements that are made available to them. And just to know, this research was conducted before the COVID-19 outbreak and gives us a pre-pandemic snapshot of the state of the research. and relationships between flexible working arrangements and health. At the time, the prevalence of flexible working arrangements was already sort of on the increase, but was nowhere near as prominent and mainstream as it is today following the pandemic from 2019. And just a very quick summary of the methods. So at the time this research was conducted, there were 33 studies available that reported the relationships between some form of flexible working arrangement and the selected employee health or health-related behaviors that we chose as outcomes. So ultimately, there were 23 studies reporting the relationship between flexible working arrangements and health, 6 for absenteeism, 10 for somatic symptoms, and 5 for physical activity. And we used Schmidt and Hunter's meta-analytic methods to analyze the relationship between flexible working arrangements in these 4 health-related outcomes. Primary study correlations were weighed based on the sample size to correct for sampling error, and mean correlation coefficients were also corrected for unreliability. So can we go ahead and move on to the results? Taking a look in the orange box, we have the corrected meta-analytic correlations to the right under row, and then to the left, we have the 95% confidence interval for each of the 4 relationships. And we can see that 3 of the 4 hypotheses were supported, suggesting a relatively small but significant relationship between flexible working arrangements and physical health, as well as with absenteeism and somatic symptoms, all in the expected directions from the hypotheses. It's also important to note there were ultimately only 5 studies that reported the relationship between flexible working arrangements and physical activity, which was the only health-related behavior that there was enough data for to include in this research at the time. And this relationship was not significant, but I think it really highlights how much more research we need looking at the impacts of flexible working arrangements on specific health-related behaviors. And as for the 2 moderating effects, so more than half of the studies did not differentiate between whether flexible working arrangements were flex time or flex place for the samples. So these ended up being coded as general flexible working arrangements. And ultimately, there were no moderating effects on the relationship with physical activity between flex time and flex place, but there was a significant moderating effect on the type of flexible working arrangement on somatic symptoms, where flex time was associated with experiencing less somatic symptoms than general flexibility, which is what we coded when there was no distinction made. But this is definitely an area of opportunity for future research to explore the different effects of the various types of flexible arrangements that are made available. And we'll have a little bit more of a clear view on that once there's more research. And the other effect that was tested looked at if flexible working arrangements utilization versus availability moderates the relationship between flexible working arrangements and the selected outcomes. And similar to the last moderation analysis, only 4 samples specifically assessed flexible working arrangement utilization. And even so, results suggest that use versus availability of flexible working arrangements does moderate the relationship with physical health, with availability resulting in stronger positive relationship with physical health than use. And there's still a lot of work to do here in terms of researching the stigma associated with participating in flexible working arrangements and sort of why we're seeing this trend between utilization versus availability impacting health differentially. And so, although the body of research on this topic was relatively small at the time that this review was conducted, these findings have significant implications for the way we think about how work structures and schedules impact employee health and well-being. The findings that flexible working arrangements are associated with better physical health, less absenteeism, and fewer somatic symptoms suggest that when applied appropriately, flexible working arrangements can help facilitate worker health and well-being. And especially in a time where flexible working arrangements, 1, are so prevalent, and 2, are so debatable, with many organizations trying to decide whether or not to mandate a return to office policy and go back to a more traditional work schedule or remain remote, or maybe switch to hybrid schedules. Every angle that we can understand about the impacts of flexible working arrangements helps us and organizations make more informed decisions about how and when and why to implement them. So this pre-pandemic snapshot of the relationships between flexible working arrangements and various aspects of health provides promising support for thinking about flexible working arrangements as a tool for supporting employee health, which is not really what comes to mind for people right off the bat when they're thinking about scheduling flexibility and flexible working arrangements. So thank you, everyone, and I'll turn it back over for the next presentation.
Thank you, Nicole. And last but not least, we have Sarah Tabo and David Padula and their paper, When Do Work Family Policies Work? Unpacking the Effects of Stigma and Financial Costs for Men and Women.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. We're really excited to be part of this group of papers and honored. It's a really fantastic collection. And let me just get this going. There we go. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So a key motivator for us in this project was this overall, which has already been mentioned today, very conveniently, the slow trend toward change in terms of gender equality, especially when we think about the gender wage gap, occupational segregation, the gender division of labor in the household. A possible solution to this problem has often been discussed is work-family policies, especially paid parental leave and flexible work arrangements. On the positive side, these work arrangements have been shown to increase women's levels of full-time employment. They also tend to promote both short and long-term increases in men's time doing unpaid work, so especially childcare and housework. But there are some challenges. They aren't exactly a silver bullet. So some examples of the problems that with these policies include the fact that policy use is often low. This is attributed to the fact that it's often not adequately compensated, so people can't afford to take it. But another driver is the fact that workers often fear that if they actually do use it, they'll be labeled as bad workers who are less deserving of work rewards, like promotions, etc. So in other words, flexibility stigma. Another issue is that policy use tends to be gender differentiated. So especially in the US, women are much more likely to have access to and to use these policies. So only 96% of US dads, for instance, return to work, or 96% of US dads return to work within 2 weeks of birth or adoption. So very few of them are really taking any sort of extended time off after the birth of a child. This gender difference in policy use can be particularly problematic because it basically can reinforce the gender division of labor in the household, but also in the workplace, it can frame these policies and policy use as something that is meant to deal with a woman's problem of balancing work and family, and that creates incentives for statistical discrimination, and of course can limit women's occupational status and also their work commitment. Okay, so for us, this left a pretty big open question, which is whether there actually are organizational conditions. So can we specify what those conditions are under which work-family policy use could become truly widespread among both men and women workers? There is quite a bit of research to point to what those conditions might be, but none of the existing studies actually demonstrated any form of causal traction on this issue. So our study objectives are to we conducted a original population-based survey experiment, which assessed the direct effects of the salience of workplace flexibility stigma, as well as declining financial costs on heterosexual men and women workers' willingness to use these policies. And so, as I mentioned, previous work is highly limited because it's correlational or non-representative. We fielded the experiment through GfK, which is a large national probability-based survey company. So this sample reduces concerns about generalizability, and we also designed it with random assignment to differing conditions with different organizational and policy features. So that limited our concerns about selection. And the sample was people ages 18 to 44 who are in the labor force, so of childbearing age. Each participant read descriptions of a 12-week parental leave policy that was either unpaid, 50% pay, or 100% pay. And they also saw a flex time policy, which was also randomized, but we're not going to talk about that because we don't have enough time to talk about those results today. To manipulate flexibility stigma, or the presence of flexibility stigma, we did this in two different ways. So first, we manipulated whether they believed that the policy use was actually linked to their promotion prospects. So this was signaled through a supervisor. And the second manipulation was through rates of policy use within the organization. So how widespread, how normative was it to be using these policies in the organization? This is our vignette. So people were told to imagine that the company where they work offered a parental leave policy to all employees. And you can see here the manipulations. So for instance, in one condition, they were told, however, your manager recently indicated that taking the full amount of leave may decrease your chances of being promoted. Or alternatively, they may have been told your manager recently indicated that taking the full amount of leave would not affect your chances of being promoted. And then we have the separate manipulation for the percentage of people who have actually been using the policy. And just to clarify one more time, this is all between subjects, so each person only read one version of this vignette. And our dependent variable is basically just asking them how likely they thought they would be to use the policy on a scale from 1 to 100. So would you really think you'd really use it or not, given these conditions? Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, David Padula, to talk about the results.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah, and it's great to be here with all of you today. All right, so in terms of presenting results, I'm going to start by, we're going to focus on our parental leave use intention variable. I'll start by talking about the effects of reducing financial costs and how those intersect with gender, then to move on to talk about the effects of reducing flexibility stigma and how those intersect with gender, and then we'll think about kind of the interactive effects between gender, financial costs, and flexibility stigma. So in the first table, what we're presenting here is a regression where we regress our use likelihood variable, which again ranges from 1 to 100 on gender, as well as the different wage replacement rates of our manipulation. And what you can see here is when we look across all conditions, men are roughly 10 points less likely than women in terms of their willingness to use the policy. So we're finding these significant gender differences in policy use intentions, which aligns with previous research. Also, if you go down a little bit in the table, you'll see the direct effects of our wage replacement rates. So when you go up to 50% wage replacement, we see an increased use likelihood and then a significant jump up by 16 points compared to the unpaid leave when we look at 100% wage replacement, which is not entirely surprising, right? As you remove these financial costs, we see an increased likelihood in use. We were also quite interested in whether gender moderated the effects of wage replacement. And what you can see here is with the interactions, that pay has a much more dramatic positive effect on men's use intentions than women's. Next, we wanted to look at kind of removing flexibility stigma. And so again, remember, we have that promotion reassurance manipulation. And so we find a large positive effect of that promotion reassurance manipulation on workers' likelihood overall of saying that they would use the policy. But interestingly, we don't see an effect of high take-up. So there's no difference between the high take-up versus low take-up on average in terms of shaping men's and women's use intentions. We also looked at gender moderation on these the flexibility stigma reductions, and we see not much going on there. So we don't see kind of a differential effect by gender in terms of, say, that promotion reassurance manipulation. We were also interested in thinking more broadly about the intersections between gender, financial costs, and flexibility stigma. And so here we're presenting predicted values from a kind of full interactive model that we present in the paper. But here what you can see is the difference between men in the dark gray and women in the light gray in terms of their use likelihood, or the predicted use likelihood intentions in the unpaid condition when there's a promotion penalty. And here we see a really large gender difference of about 25 points on that 100-point scale. What's interesting is when we kind of remove those constraints, so in the next set of bars, we present the unpaid condition, but where there's promotion reassurance, we see the gender gap close there. Next, when we have 100% wage replacement, but keep the promotion penalty, we also see the gender gap close. And then when you have both 100% pay and promotion reassurance, we see a similar pattern there. And so it's really the story of kind of when you remove these constraints, we can see the gender gap close in terms of use likelihood intentions. So in terms of key takeaways, this paper really comes into the literature with the backdrop of gender inequality and work-family conflict generating significant financial losses for organizations and issues around broader gender inequality in the labor market. And so we see this our paper as making some interventions in terms of ways to address that, where policymakers and organizational leaders can increase and equalize policy use by, one, potentially developing innovative strategies for culture change within the organization. So for example, encouraging supervisors to find ways of decoupling policy use from work opportunities and rewards. And also, of course, reducing the direct financial costs that workers bear and when they use these types of policies. We thought we'd conclude with just a few caveats. So of course, here in the survey experimental context, our outcomes are hypothetical. However, we'll note that the gender gap in use intentions is quite similar to what we see in some survey data of actual use. Our policy use intention measures are also limited, so we don't know necessarily what fraction of the 12-week leave someone would use, which could be an important follow-up to look at. Also, our organizational norm interventions, that proportion of workers who uptake the policy might be conservative because this is kind of a hypothetical context. And then our policy design interventions are also limited in the sense that we don't include things like primary caregiver clauses, which are often used in companies in the real world and may affect gender gaps in usage. But overall, we think that these findings start to point to a path forward in thinking about ways that organizations can craft work-family policies to help reduce gender inequality both in the workplace and at home. So thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for just wonderful presentations. I've got the honor of being the person that's going to help field questions. What would be very helpful to me is if you have a question that you both raise your hand and then turn your camera on, because I believe what will happen is that you will then move to the top of my screen, and we currently have over 30 people in our session, so it doesn't everybody fit on the same screen. So if you have a question, just turn your camera on and raise your hand, and I'll be able to call on you. As everybody's getting prepped to do that, I'll take the liberty of asking the first question and making an appreciative comment. I could do that to any of the groups. But what I want to do is just start by complimenting Jane on identifying the 4 different intensive parenting groups. That's just very, very useful, I think. And my question to you is what are your plans to use those different classifications moving forward now that you've identified the patterns and that you've made some predictions of who's more likely to be in these patterns? Have you got any intent of looking in terms of outcomes and thinking about the impact it has on sort of any number of things that might go on in people's lives?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Right now, what I'm working on is, so the latent class I presented was on parents with young kids, and I'm working on latent classes of older kids at the moment. But after that, I do think there are a lot of really interesting things that could be done looking at how the latent classes affect child outcomes as well as mothering outcomes too.
That's lovely. Thank you. Okay, let's open it up beyond me to questions for our panelists. Oh, Margot, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes. Hi. I have a question for Sarah and David, probably partly because it's fresh in my mind, having just presented, but really interesting paper. This surely reflects my legal naivete. Like, I don't know anything about the law, but the idea that an employer could tell a worker that they won't be promoted for, if they take a leave, like, just sounds horrifying to me, which doesn't mean that it's not legal. But I guess that's my question is, is that something that would potentially open employers up to a discrimination complaint, or is that actually perfectly legal to do in the American workplace?
I don't know if David has something to.
Go for it, Sarah. You can jump in. Yeah.
I'll just say briefly, not to my knowledge, I don't think that that's illegal, actually, but I could be wrong about that. What we're trying to simulate, though, is the experience that many workers have, which is there are insinuations. It might not be so direct as like, well, you're not going to get this promotion if you take this. It's sort of like, well, this other person took this leave and then they really didn't get promoted because they couldn't cut it, or they weren't here long enough, or they were out of it for too long. And so I think sometimes it's not a direct statement, it's an insinuation, but there's a strong belief that it will jeopardize their ability to make it through the organization. But yeah, to my knowledge, it's not illegal. I don't know, David, what you think there?
Yeah, I would say, just kind of echoing what Sarah said, I think the idea here is really to make it clear that we know in organizations a lot people get signals both from supervisors and from coworkers that various rewards and opportunities down the road may be at jeopardy for taking leave. And so it's really trying to simulate that in as concrete of a way as possible.
And Jennifer has her hand raised.
Please excuse my the quality of my voice. So first, I want to say thank you so much for all the presentations. It was just so lovely to hear about all this amazing work, and also thinking about the connections among the papers as they were presented. While Jane was presenting about 4 different types of motherhood, I was thinking back to Margot's presentation and wondering about whether variation in access to resources across states, right, might help us understand some of this variation of, say, the presence of strained mothers. So I thought there were some just really great connections here. I had a follow-up for Sarah and David. Really, really interesting paper, very cool experiment. I was wondering sort of, I understand that the gender gap is sort of roughly the same as what's observed in real life, but I'm wondering about just the sort of the high intentions for take-up. So 70% of women and 40% of men saying, yes, when it's unpaid and I'm going to have a penalty promotion, I'm interested in taking those 12 weeks of leave. And I think in reality, workers at large companies who've been there a year have access to the FMLA, have access to that exact scenario, right? Of like 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And I don't think 40% of men are taking that up. So it seems like potentially another example of sort of the disconnect between intentions and what people actually do in reality when they're confronted with these sort of complicated decisions in their real life. I'm just wondering about your thoughts about sort of those rates.
Yeah, so that's I think a really interesting question. I think comes to one of the caveats we laid out at the end, that the question's about using the leave, but not necessarily exactly how much of the leave that they would use. And so I think, thinking about additional ways of, building in scope conditions and thinking in more nuanced ways about what's going on, is that it may be that people are thinking, oh yeah, I would use the leave, but if it's unpaid, I would use a shorter amount, that sort of thing. And so I think that might be part of what's underlying those higher rates. But I think you're also right that I think this is a real, thing that we thought about a lot with this paper, and the kind of intention use, or the use intentions, is that it's not like rubber meets the road, can I make this work? It's like, is this kind of a thing that I would want to do? And that there may be, some challenges with thinking about how does that map onto actual use rates, that people may be more aspirational than they actually can be when the rubber meets the road.
I'd also just followed up just to a reminder, the way we measured it, it's how likely would you be? So it's on a scale of 0 to 100. So, if the average, the predicted is like 40, that's on a scale of 0 to 100. It's not 40% said yes, right? It's not a binary yes, no, I'll use it. So the meaning of it is a little bit different than translating it to percentage of people who would use it, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a likelihood scale.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. That's really helpful.
And I'm seeing on my technology that you actually don't have to turn your cameras on for me to see who's got their hand raised. It shows me at the top of my screen. Daniela has her hand raised.
Oh, hi, do you hear me? And do you hear me? Yes? Okay. Hi, yeah, I want to echo and thank you for all this wonderful presentation as well. My question is for Jane. So I thought this was super interesting, and I kept wondering, from what I understood, there's data on couples, but specifically on mothers' attitudes. So I kept wondering about the fathers. So whether you have data on the fathers, or plans of considering what is their role. So do we have fathers that are like also very intensive, but do not help at all? Is that, for example, increasing? That's what's happening, like kind of with these strained mothers. I just kept thinking about this. Thank you.
Yeah. Great question. So unfortunately, the way that the child development supplement was, that data were collected, is that they asked people to identify a primary caregiver, and then kind of only primarily collected information on their parenting attitudes and stuff. So I don't have that much information about dads, because there just weren't that many dads that were identified as a primary caregiver. And to follow up on what you said about strained mothers, one thing that I did find kind of interesting about them is that they weren't particularly likely to be single mothers, and they were pretty affluent. So it doesn't seem like a lack of resources or help or something. I think it might be that those women have really high expectations for themselves, and are kind of for whatever reason just not meeting it, and are almost penalizing themselves for it. But yeah, I would love if anybody ever collects rich data on fathers. I would love to have access to it.
Thank you.
And Annette has her hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much to all the presenters. This was super interesting. I have a question for Lila and one for Jane also, and they're kind of a bit related. So let me start maybe with Lila. Here I was thinking, to what extent do you think these findings are specific to Germany, or can they also be used to explain the stall in the US? I mean, and overall, I think Germany is a fairly low work intensity society with quite high regulations on working hours. And how might this look in societies that are more high work intensity, larger culture of overwork and so on, or maybe the opposite, even less so as in some of the Scandinavian countries. So if you could, if you have any thoughts on, extending this comparatively and what you would expect. And also for Jane, I mean, this intensive parenting here in Germany, I think it's really interesting. I always feel like it's here now too, but it came a bit later, and it's a lot tied to status anxiety. So the most intensive parenting, at least that's sort of the general perception, is of middle-class parents who are fighting downward mobility. And here I was also wondering if you have any indications of that in your data, sort of the loss of anxieties of status loss that might be attached sort of to this intensive parenting, or if there's anything specific to the US context that might further these parenting practices that you're seeing. Yeah, so thanks a lot. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Annette. Great question, because I skipped this point in the presentation. So contrary to the United States, overwork didn't have an effect like it did there. So Germany kind of mirrors the American experience. We had here maternal employment trying to pull women back onto the labor market. That was just never debated in the States. And there's actually research on part-time too that shows in the United States, part-time doesn't have an effect. So I think a big part of it is that it was a policy especially targeted at women as maternal part-time employment. And we also don't observe it in the Nordic states because they're more focused, as far as I understand, of everyone, men and women, working full-time. And I personally, if we think about the children, would tend to go more into a direction of dual carers, dual earners, and see a lot of potential in part-time work to fulfill this model. And a big role would be men's changes in the labor market too.
Okay, I'll go next. Thank you so much for your questions. I think what you were talking about the like status loss anxiety, like that to me, actually, I would guess that the strain moms might fall in that category. They were pretty affluent, but I don't know. It's hard because I don't have exact data on it, but I would guess that there's like a keeping up with the Joneses type thing, or at least when it comes to mothering expectations. As far as the US context, I think definitely like all of my results are framed through like what so many of our other presenters here today talked about, of like just having so little access to like government resources and paid leave and stuff like that compared to so many European countries. I'm definitely interested to see how this would compare to many European countries, including Germany, and especially France seems to be like a weird outlier in terms of intensive mothering. And I can't figure out why that is exactly. Yeah, I wish I had a better kind of more specific answer for you other than just, I would love to do this in other countries and see how it compares. I was a little bit surprised by some of the US results. And yeah, I would be interested to see how this compares kind of cross-culturally as well.
And OJ has his hand up.
Hello, I'm OJ from Harvard University, and thank you so much for all the presentations. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for organizing this event. I have a question to Professor Margot Jackson. I really enjoyed the paper and the presentation, and just but there's some report nowadays that the childcare costs are kind of vary across the states as well, and it might be the case for like developmental, like private childcare costs or developmental like child spending, so that the kind of price of the spending might be different across the states. And then just wondering your thoughts about how you're finding about the class gaps, different class gaps across the states. Is a function of different spending to the same service versus the different prices of the service across the states.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you bring up the example of childcare costs, but we could also think about tuition more generally, right? Or for particularly for kind of gaps in private school and that type of thing. The measure that I talked about does not include expenditures on tuition, which would include childcare costs, which we do intentionally, partly for the reasons that you mentioned. It's one of the things that kind of I have wanted to look at, but it's also difficult to look at because of the difficulty in understanding differences across states in the cost of services, but also measuring childcare spending at the state level is also fairly difficult. So in the database that we used for that paper, childcare expenditures at the state level are in there, but they're not able to be disaggregated because they're often rolled in with other types of supports related to income. It's income supports. We've just done some expansions to the database that will allow us to pull out childcare spending. And so one of my goals is to be able to look at childcare spending, and in particular how that relates to some of these same types of expenditures, but also to childcare expenditures, if we can figure out a way to adjust for the cost of childcare. So that's not really an answer to your question. It's more an acknowledgement that I think it's really important to adjust for differences in the cost of services. I think it's less relevant for the items that we look at, which is one of the reasons why we used a more narrow measure of developmental expenditures, but incredibly relevant for childcare. So I'll kind of punt and say that I'm going to look at that later.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all for participating in today's virtual conference series events. Again, congratulations to all of our panelists, and for the recognition that they so roundly deserve. It's just wonderful. A special thanks to Jennifer Hook, Richard Pesson, Shelley, MacDermid, Wadsworth, for all of their work in bringing today's event together. And I hope to see many of you, if not all of you, at our next event that's going to be in October. And you can find information about our future virtual conference series events and our 2024 conference on our website, WFRN.org. And I do hope to see you in Montreal in June of 2024. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.